during the difficult periods of the Roman occupation of Palestine, the Romans, for the most part, did not interfere with the internal structure of Jewish ethics. There were exceptions, but the Romans respected such mystical sects as the Essenes, protected them, favored them, and excused them from military service and other practices common to the Roman state. In North Africa, the Romans tolerated the Gnostics and the Neoplatonists and the Neo-Pythagoreans. We may say, generally speaking, that the Romans were interested in only two essential restrictions upon the lives of the people. The first, that the private citizen keep out of politics, and second, that he paid his taxes. With these two decisions in his favor, he had a great deal of personal freedom. After the fall, however, of the Roman Empire, conditions became rapidly worse on the level of scholarship. Obviously, the circumstances contributing to the decline and fall of Rome filled the region and time with chaos. There was very little opportunity for the advancement of any positive cultural system. Human beings were fighting for existence, and for the most part were bitterly disillusioned, not only with their temporal leadership, but with the religion which they had previously known. Out of this general chaos arose the beginnings of the Holy Roman Empire. Christendom became, in time, the dominating religious force of the Mediterranean area. At this time also, Christendom, which had gone through a very difficult time, began to sense the possibility not only of spiritual but temporal leadership in European affairs. As a result, gradually the ante-Nicene fathers, who were mostly apologists, gave way to the post-Nicene followers and fathers, who were mostly militant exponents of their doctrines. This meant that the remnants of the old philosophic empire lost all possibility of survival in Europe, at least for the present. The only way to escape the spreading animosity of the new religion was to depart into the desert. And at first in the more remote cities, then in small towns, and finally in villages, the remnants of the old doctrines held their own, in some cases for centuries, very largely through vigilance and secrecy. When we consider the situation in the Near East, we have to realize, therefore, that into it flowed the best of the knowledge of the time. Here, the caliphs of Baghdad had a great interest in and tolerance for the learning that Europe was discarding. They welcomed the mathematicians and the post-Pythagoreans into their fraternity of learning. They also were quick to pick up the scientists that had been scattered by the changing climate in Europe. They had a great affinity for the poets, for literature, and for the old wisdom of the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Persians and many other peoples. Also into this same, at first we might call it a hodgepodge of factors, a number of Christian groups also took refuge. As the church began to get more temporal authority, it demanded conformity. And almost immediately it developed heretics. One of the earliest and most powerful of these heresies was the Nestorian. Another, almost equally positive and widespread, was the Manichaean. Both of these groups, essentially Christian in their point of view, certainly heavily influenced by the rising tide of Christian mysticism, both of these groups were anathematized, cast out of Christendom, and forced to flee for existence. The Near East became the sanctuary, therefore, for Christian nonconformists as well as pagans. The Christian nonconformists had quite a problem on their hands in many instances. They traveled very far to escape some form of intolerance. The Nestorians took refuge in China. It is also known that Jewish mystical sects were forced to flee. And in the course of the early centuries, under both Christian and later Muslim persecution, we know they reached China, India, Tibet. And according to an account which I recently heard, they even reached Japan at the beginning of the Christian era. In any event, there was a scattering of learning. There was a diaspora which included not only one sect or one group, but many different lines of belief. We learn also from contemporary records in Arabia at that time that the problem of who was right in religion gained almost the importance that we face today in trying to decide whether Johnson is better than Goldwater. The problem of religion was on the lips of every man in Damascus, in Baghdad, in Basra, and other centers where these religious groups mingled in such strange confusion. Caravan drivers were talking about the Holy Trinity. Merchants were arguing about the Immaculate Conception. And individuals whom you might regard as little better than tradesmen were attempting the quadrature of the circle and the triangulation of the right angle, or the trisection of the right angle. Astronomy, mathematics, medicine, optics. These suddenly became the concerns and interests of common so-called proletarian groups. The Near East was aflame with inquiry, with intellectual curiosity on almost every conceivable subject. And always there were exiles, heretics, individuals who had escaped, maybe only with their lives, leaving all their worldly goods behind, who were willing to open schools on the steps of mosques or in some oasis in the desert and teach these hungry people all that they had brought with them from the lost culture of the Mediterranean. This was a very interesting time, a very important period in the structure of Near Eastern mystical tradition. Underneath practically every system that escaped into the desert, there were mystical factors. The Greek rites, the great ceremonial initiations of the Dionysian and Eleusinian rites were represented in the Near East. The deeper mysteries of Kabbalism found root there. Some of the best Kabbalists produced were among the Arabs. Alchemy found a footing. Magic, all kinds of seership, abstract speculations about the structure of the universe, astronomy, and all these phases of learning, anatomy, physiology, biology, medicine. were developing very rapidly among the Arabs and the Persians. It is interesting to realize this because it was the departure of practically all learning from Europe that led to the terrible misfortune that we call the Dark Ages. And it was not until this same learning by devious route finally came back to Europe through the Moorish universities of Spain that this dark veil upon the minds of men was finally lifted again. Aristotle and Plato reached medieval Europe by way of Arabia, not by a direct descent through Greece and Rome. When this new learning appeared, incidentally, in Europe, it found a rather rapid acceptance. By this time, centuries had passed. The Dark Ages had frightened man, had filled the European with a strange uneasiness and distrust. He had already felt the terrible weight of superstition upon him. He had gone through these awful experiences of fear, the belief in the end of the world, the parades and processions of penitents marching about Europe, leaving their bodies on every roadside. It was a very unhappy time. So the universities were rather quick to accept back again the lost heritage of the Greeks and the Latins and the Egyptians, even though it did in some measure conflict with the rising power of Christendom. After all, Christendom also had passed through a very difficult time. And actually, the Christian church was nothing but people. And these people, as their needs changed, were forced to acknowledge the demand for enlightenment. But to go back to the Near East, where our problem principally rests, we find that just as surely as physics became important, metaphysics likewise was sensed as a valid way of study. The Muslim, although rather conservative in his religious thinking, never built the powerful barriers against scientific and rational progress that some of the religions, unfortunately, built about them. He was therefore able to accept a great deal of knowledge without turning and directly persecuting the sources of knowledge. At the same time, under the caliphs, the faith of Islam was developing a strong orthodoxy. What had been almost a spiritual motion among the Arabic people began to take on the formal appearance of an extreme sectarianism. Thus, the Orthodox Muslim almost reached the point where he was inclined to cast out heretics, and the old patterns repeated themselves to some degree. But the Arab was a much more subtle person than the European. He found different ways of perpetuating his convictions and beliefs. A mysticism did arise in Christianity, and this mysticism ultimately became completely accepted as long as it was within the structure of the church. A mysticism also arose in Arabia, and this likewise was accepted as long as it was held within the boundaries of the Muslim law. Also, by nature of his peculiar emotionalism, the Near Easterner had a great love for the pomp and circumstance of mystical ritual and for the strange nocturnal assemblies of saints and saviors. It was rather picturesque, and he was deeply affected by these traditions and these practices that had come to him from another region. By degrees, the best of Islam was associated with its mystical orders, and in these orders can be traced most of the religions of the time. For the Near East was also in the crossroads between Europe and Asia. The traffic from Europe to the Near East was far heavier than the traffic in the opposite direction. But in the relations of Islam to the Far East, there was a continuous two-way traffic. So finally, in this mysterious melting pot of metaphysics, the Near East, we find Mediterranean culture, Far Eastern culture, brought together to form one of the most interesting basic patterns that we know. There's probably no other group in the world that has had so many influences operating upon it, has accepted into its structure so many concepts derived from different sources as the dervishes and the Sufis of Islam. Here we find the Buddhist doctrines, the Hindu beliefs, the ancient Avestan concepts. We find everything from Siberian shamanism to North African Gnosticism. One of the interesting points, it seems, is that all of these different borrowings, when lumped and heaped together, should prove compatible. This, I think, the Arabs were rather quick to notice. They suddenly realized that while the outer bodies of sects were constantly warring, the deeper parts of the doctrines were in conformity. Each contributed something to the general advancement of man's insight. All nations, all peoples had ultimately come to the conclusion that man's search for truth must be a personal, internal experience. That it is not possible for him to find the ultimates that he seeks in institutions of any kind. No matter how many study together, each man must walk the road to enlightenment alone. He may be encouraged, he may be helped, but in the end, he must explore with his own consciousness alone those mysteries which are necessary in order that he may answer the eternal questions that human beings have asked from the beginning. The Persian mystics and the Muslim saints, therefore, sensed very quickly the need for a kind of an invisible fraternity. They perhaps gained part of this very concept itself from some of the secret groups of the Near East that had preceded them, or the Mediterranean, especially perhaps the Pythagorean school, whose scattered adepts still had some kind of contact with each other. Out of all of this came a very loosely organized fraternity, a fraternity of persons, many of whom never actually met each other bodily, but were in some kind of internal communion. Part of the Sufi doctrine is extremely reminiscent of Taoism and Zen. It is a perpetuation without oral instruction. It was the belief that men had certain intuitive powers, that they could extend their consciousness to a union, that without speaking, men might commune with the saints, and the saints, though not visible, could bestow their benedictions and their instructions upon men. The saints of Islam are very much like the Rishi of India or the Arhats of Buddhism, strange, mysterious beings whose long shadow returned to Europe in the form of the alchemical adepts, those who possessed the secrets of secrets and wandered unknown along the roads of Europe, visiting one town after another, bestowing their blessings and their insight upon the honest chemists they met along the way. Alchemy was flourishing, not only in Arabia, but in China and in India. All these old mystical psychological systems were operating in the vast area which we call the deserts of Arabia, Yemen, and the Nejd. The mere fact that Islam had achieved a certain orthodoxy only perhaps added to this mystical importance. Even in the Quran, and certainly in the apocryphal writings of Islam, there is much to suggest that Muhammad himself was not only a mystic, but was in communication with other mystics. That perhaps even he belonged to this elusive order of semi-human, semi-divine teachers who corresponded to the great Mahatma and Yoga and yogis of India. So we have the gradual growth of an invisible empire. No one questioned its existence. No one perhaps quite knew where it was. Everyone believed in it and defended it, but could not swear that a member had ever been seen, or anything distinct or definite was actually known about these green-robed teachers who could materialize and dematerialize at will, like the mysterious alchemical adepts of Korea and China. But there was this belief in an invisible empire of the enlightened. To this empire belonged the great axis of the dervish order himself, who could never be seen by mortals except at the feast of Ramadan, when he was seated for a few moments upon the roof of the Kaaba at Mecca. All these legends and stories gained authority not so much through any physical relations between people as the result of these inner mystical trances. Mysticism opened up the inner life of the Muslim, giving him new keys with which to interpret the secrets of the Quran, a new wonder for the mysterious night journey of the Prophet Muhammad through the gates of the 7 parts of the universe into the presence of the eternal God. All these matters were constantly considered. They were meditated upon by the pious and by those who were seeking to understand the mysterious universal key to all knowledge, the concept of which they had inherited from Egypt, Greece, and Rome. In the midst of this, we can point out the personality of Omar Khayyam. He flourished in the 12th century. We like to think of him sometimes as Omar the tent maker. Perhaps he was better known in his own time as Omar the astronomer and the poet. We do not know a great deal about him as a person. We do know that as a young man he met the mysterious teacher or adept or sorcerer, however you wish to regard him, who was later to become the head of the secret fraternity of the Hassani. He is said, Omar is said to have been a blood brother of Ibn Saba, the mad magician of Mount Alamut. He is said to have studied the secret teachings of the Holy House of Cairo, where there was a university of magical arts, of mystical teachings and beliefs. Here disciples, seated on the marble pavement of a Muslim mosque, were reading Aristotle and Plato and studying the abstract musical theories of Pythagoras, all under the broad banner of Islam, and all dedicated to the advancement of the religion of the prophet. Omar left behind him a considerable mass of poetry. The part we are most familiar with is called the Rubaiyat. But the majority of those who have enjoyed it have actually never read the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. They have read what has been somewhat facetiously referred to as the Rubaiyat of Edward Fitzgerald's interpretation. I got that one twisted around my tongue. But Fitzgerald's Rubaiyat is really not the work at all. It is really only a paraphrasing of certain elements of the Rubaiyat. There is no verse in Fitzgerald that agrees really with a single verse of Omar's poem. But altogether, Fitzgerald captured the spirit of the poem. He perhaps did a better job than Omar, because he took the very soul of a very lengthy and overwritten original and reduced it to a rather compact form which conveys the strange pessimism of Omar, the strange mysticism which underlies all of his poems. Fitzgerald also captures the mysterious structure of the quatrains, one of the most interesting and dramatic forms of poetic writing, peculiarly suitable to Sufi poetry. In bringing together the elements of Omar's philosophy, Fitzgerald was also aware of the curious pessimism which really distinguishes the work. So we have to try to understand this pessimism a little better. About 50 or 75 years ago, the Rubaiyat became a very favored book among English-speaking people. Through Fitzgerald's translation, it fitted into the mood of a transition period in Western man's way of life. In the years around World War I, even as far as the beginning of the Depression, men in the West were very uncertain in their thinking. Materialism and materialistic science, industry, had undermined man's faith. And this undermining, this nostalgia about the difficulty in believing, sort of fitted in with the mood of Omar, and Omar fitted in to the mood of a disillusioned generation of Western peoples. For a time, the Rubaiyat was on almost everyone's library table. It was much discussed and almost constantly read. Everyone felt a little sad and weary after reading it, and this was considered almost a good sign. It had something to do with the disillusionment of the time. Because it was read very largely by individuals in an intellectual predicament, it is only natural that they should have approached it pessimistically and interpreted it negatively. A negative attitude in the reader would certainly justify assuming that Omar was a pretty badly disillusioned man. But let's study the general undercurrent of the poem more carefully. Perhaps some will say that Omar was a fatalist, which is more or less a Muslim characteristic. To the Muslim, there is an inevitable. Everything is predestined and foreordained. The individual marching along the road is going where it was intended that he should go long before he was born. The place where man meets death was predestined. Even as late as the World War II period, Muslim troops were almost completely fatalistic. To them, they lived in a universe of unchangeable destinies. And some recording angel, some mysterious power in heaven, had their destiny in a book or on a scroll and from this writing there could be no escape. Omar seems to suggest this kind of thinking. Perhaps, however, what Omar is really thinking about is much the same that we find in the philosophy of Buddha. To Buddha, this world was a strangely pessimistic sphere. Yet out of Buddhism came a great idealistic philosophy. And the same happened essentially in Arabia. The pessimism of Omar, like the pessimism of Buddha, is based upon an insight into the differences between reality and the conditions of illusion in which we live. To Omar, this world and all that it contained was a kind of dreaming. A world in which nothing was very important and never could be. There was a revulsion in him against the materialism and rather sensuous background of Arabian life. He sensed the futility of everything. Buddha also sensed this universal futility, but in some way he was able to leave a more positive attitude among those who studied his work. Perhaps Omar did not wish to leave this positive attitude. He wished to point out that the existence that we know is an utter, complete, inevitable futility. He gathered some of this pessimism perhaps from the old Orthodox Jewish beliefs, some from the terrible fears that were raging through Christendom at that time. In the days of Omar, Christendom was living in a state of continuous terror, where Christendom was convinced that the world was about to end and all men would perish together for their sins. It was a time of sin and negation. It was everywhere in the air because men felt they deserved it. Perhaps this is again why we have strange moral doubts and uncertainties stirring in our consciousness today. There is an uneasiness in us, rooted essentially in the realization of our own shortcomings. If we carefully study Omar, however, we see that what he is actually telling us is that the procedures, the courses of life to which we have become addicted are meaningless. And with the true insight of the Sufi, who incidentally is paralleled in Europe by another group in the Christian world called the Ignorantine Friars, that all material knowledge is absolute vanity. This, of course, is an extreme point of view, but it arose in a time of extremes. Yet perhaps somewhere in this rather exaggerated attitude, there is a considerable amount of basic truth. Most reformers overdo it a little, and Omar was no exception to the general rule. In an effort to drive home his point, he presented perhaps a more doleful picture than was absolutely necessary. But it is not correct, even in studying the Fitzgerald translation, to come to the conclusion that there is no relief or contrast in the Rubaiyat. It is not all negative. It is a curious mingling and mixture of disillusionment and abstract idealism. It tells us not only the futility of existence, but also strangely and mysteriously invites us into another kind of existence which is not futile. This is probably the strength of the entire document as a larger poem, as it was originally written by Omar, and the more condensed version in the English translation. In this poem, Omar makes use of a series of symbols. It has a very interesting play upon words, double meanings. He did not invent these double meanings, but they were current in the mystical literature of his time, and we find them arising again in Europe when the troubadours, bringing back Islamic mysticism, gave us the cycle of the Grail legends, and later the great structure that Wagner was to use in the preparation of his Parsifal and Lohengrin. This mysterious double use of word meanings. And if we study the Rubaiyat, we shall understand that actually it is an invitation to a mystical experience. The poem, as it is abridged and condensed by Fitzgerald, makes this far more obvious than in the longer writing, where the arrangement is less fortunate of the various quatrains. We also find the same mass of implication and symbolism in the Arabian Nights Entertainment. And of course it is everywhere throughout the poetic writings of Jalaluddin Rumi, the Mesnevi. Always words used for a secret meaning, to imply far more than is to be found in the text itself. Many morose persons, or some who have other attitudes, have decided that Omar must have been the great inebriate of history. He seemed to have no interest in life except in becoming intoxicated. On the slightest provocation, he admits beyond question that he was never deep in anything but wine. No matter what happens, he invites everyone to drink themselves into forgetfulness. Now, whether this has contributed to the acute alcoholism of the present generation, we do not know, but this was certainly not his original meaning. The Sufis before him and after him, and many other of the mystical sects of the area, knew perfectly well that Omar's wine was no different from the Eucharist of the Church. Wine was the symbol among ancient peoples of the release of the internal psychic nature. They realized, of course, that the individual, under the stimulation of wine, might have extrasensory experiences. We are told in the early days that it was even recorded that the communion cup of the church was drugged in order to produce trances. Well, however we want to feel about that, the main point is, as we mentioned last week, that Omar's wine is the wine of ecstasy. It is the mystical experience. It is the transformation of life by a strange enthusiasm or in-godness. The mystic picked up into ecstasy is drunk with God. And even some of the most prosaic saints of Christendom have admitted the parallel, namely that it was almost as though they had actually been carried into ecstasy by the communion cup itself. Consequently, Omar points out through all of his apparently alcoholic reverie that what he really is trying to tell us is that when living conditions, world affairs, problems arise, we cannot really solve them by our fears, by our worries, by our rationalizations, by any of these processes with which we are commonly familiar. The only way, according to the Rubaiyat, finally, to dissolve all problems is to fall in love with God. In the moment of emergency, to suddenly align oneself with the eternal, to sense one's inner life picked up by a supreme adoration for the divine power and a complete admiration for the wonders of the universe. If man is so entirely aware of God that the love of God fills every part of his nature, so that there is no longer any place where this love of God is not apparent to him, he must at the same time be aware of this divine presence, not only in the friend but in the foe, not only in the mysteries of life but in the mysteries of death, that everything that exists within the ecstasy of God, atoms dancing in the sunbeam, every bit of life moving, like even the electrons forever vibrating on their little polar axes, everything alive with the presence of God. To know this, to be picked up by it, to lose oneself completely in it, is to be called one of the God-intoxicated saints. We know that this is not very different in essence and substance from the mystical experiences observed in the life of Sri Ramakrishna, the great Vedantic saint. It is said that he passed into a state of ecstasy so easily that all of a sudden a great and beautiful expression came over his face and he lost consciousness in the tremendous internal experience of the immediate presence of the Divine Mother. This losing oneself, becoming completely powerless in the grasp of the infinite, this type of thing has always been close to the Eastern soul, whether it was the soul of Lao Tzu, or Buddha, or the Vedantic saints, or Patanjali. Whoever wrote of these things in the East writes of this strange experience in which the individual suddenly ceases to have any ordinary function as we know it, suddenly loses himself in a condition in which he is utterly incapable of self-control because he is God-controlled. He has no longer any desire to be a self, to have his own attitudes or his own convictions. He wishes only to be that. He wishes only to be united with the spirit of infinite life itself. Looking out into the universe, he does not see it as a place of planets and elements. He does not think of it in terms of space conquest. Rather, to him, the universe is suddenly transformed into the embracing power of infinite love. Everything is transformed into love rather than into wisdom. Everything outpours with divine grace, with infinite mercy. Even Havelock Ellis, in describing his mystical experience in the dance of life, comes very much to the same conclusion. Suddenly nothing is important that used to be important. Suddenly there can be no doubt about things that we once questioned. The problem of wealth and poverty, of friendship and animosity, things of this nature simply fade into nothingness. For all opposites, all contrived conditions produced by man himself cease in the infinite presence of the deity. This attitude perhaps opens the entire concept of the Rubaiyat. For the first words in the Fitzgerald translation, they simply begin with the thought, awake. It is as though we are asked to suddenly come into a different kind of a world. We are told that the sun has scattered into flight, the stars before it on the plains of night. We are given the symbolism of dawn. And in this first great moment of dawn, the sun strikes the Sultan's palace with a shaft of light. The Sultan's palace or turret or tower or mosque always has the same meaning. It represents the human mind. It represents man. Man is the Sultan. His palace is his body. The dome of his palace or his minaret is always his mind. And therefore, in awaking, the coming of the spiritual dawn is when the light strikes the consciousness, the mind, that which is within the body, that which is the symbol of the Sultan's abode. For the Sultan is self-will, the person, the ego, the false personality of Buddhism and Taoism. But this must be struck with light, and this light must come from the mystery of the sun. And everywhere in the religions of the world, the sun has come finally to be identified with the illuminator. It is always the symbol of spiritual light. And to the points of Islam, the light of the sun became the proper symbol of man's becoming aware of the reality of things. It was the opening up of the darkened mind to the truth of eternal light. It was the rescuing of the person from his doubts, from his uncertainties, from his arguments, from his discords, from his jealousies, his antagonisms, his prejudices, all of which belong to the dark world. But when the light of the eternal sun strikes the tower or turret with its shaft, the sleeping reality in man awakens. This is the beginning of the Rubaiyat message, that we must suddenly recognize the coming of the dawn. To the man of the desert, the dawn was very real and important. And as he watched it breaking across the sands and the mountains and the ragged rocks, he beheld the wonder of the world. For this dawn was the symbol of the dawning within man of the reality of himself, the rescuing of his consciousness from delusion and illusion. And in the common experience of the individual, how do we interpret this? I think all mystics are in common agreement. Bene, the German mystic, refers to this enlightenment as a lightning flash. St. Paul, in the mysterious occurrence on the road to Damascus, the theophany, had no way of estimating why it happened. But all of the mystics have been in agreement that, unworthy as they are, and it is part of mysticism itself, part of the humility of goodness, that those who are truly good are most aware of their own imperfections. By some power, then, that perhaps may be likened to grace, but may perhaps still more be attributed simply to the inevitable eternal love of God for its creation, that there comes a time in the life of every person who has wandered in darkness, who has perhaps sought with what faculties he possessed, but not too effectively, for a better way of life. Sometime comes the dawn. Suddenly the inner world begins to lighten within the person. An experience occurs in him. And this experience transforms the universe from within himself. This is an essential concept of mysticism. Everything is changed because man's own point of view is changed. Nothing remains the same because man is no longer the same. And in the story of the Rubaiyat, we find the first suggestion of the true meaning, in that the reader is invited to be aware of the transcendental significance of the whole poem. It is assumed that he is challenged to awaken. And when he awakens, what happens? according to Omar, whose degree of awakenedness we do not know, but who might have had considerable insight if we are to judge by his poems. Awaking produces two moods. One is the sudden realization of what is real, and the other is the sudden realization of what is unreal. We discover things that were so very important and very significant to us, and they no longer have any meaning at all. We learn the strange transitoriness of things. We realize how short is the span of human life, how melancholy it must be for those who have no light. We find, therefore, that everything that once held our attention and seemed real or purposeful suddenly becomes comparatively useless. But in the poem, as in Zen and in many other systems of mysticism, illumination is not simply exchanging an irrational concept for a rational one, in which suddenly we become wiser. This is not the essential concept in mysticism as it was understood in the Near East. We therefore do not start out on a new kind of life with a new polarization. We do not take on the world again with greater insight and continue to struggle with all the old problems, simply approaching them a little more wisely. This was not the mystic point of view. This is the philosophical approach, and for many it is the best road, but this is not Omar's concept. To Omar, when the individual gives up the old way, there is nothing left except the beloved. There is no longer any real reason to do things any better than we did them before, because they have no meaning anyway. What difference does it make whether we please our neighbor or we do not please our neighbor, if both ourselves and our neighbor will vanish away? This does not mean that we should be indifferent of others, far from it. It does not mean, therefore, that we should settle down to a calculated indifference to the requirements of other people. What it really means is that whatever we do after we have once seen reality, we do it only for other people, inasmuch as our own internal adjustment no longer requires that we be understood, only that we understand. This is the beginning of the Bodhisattva doctrine of the Mahayana Buddhist. The Bodhisattva is simply the individual who by evolution has reached the point where the world is no longer meaningful to him. He stands at the threshold of the Parinirvana. He can go on to the infinite. But it is the obligation or vow of the Bodhisattva that he will not go on to the infinite rest as long as suffering remains in the world. So he turns back to help this suffering, not because the world can do anything for him or to him, but because there is so much that he can do for the world. He can never be captured again in any illusion. He can never be held fast in any false doctrine. But he is capable, through the quietude of inner insight, to make a certain contribution to the evolution of the universe around him. This, again, is the Sufi point of view. Once the illumination comes, man no longer needs the world, but it still may be that the world needs him. But whatever he does with the full realization that he is not captured, he is not involved, he is not entwined in this complicated situation. He serves only one principle, and that is the principle of infinite good itself. It is not necessary for him to make any further compromise in his own character. Thus he is in this world, but not of it. He wanders along the road, but he is far away. Even though, however, he be far away, he is always near, because he has become more and more like the love of God, which surpasseth understanding. Like the infinite insight which he has begun to experience in himself, he is becoming omniscient and omnipresent. He can be in many places, in many conditions at one time, simply because the love of God can be everywhere, always. It is hard to put these thoughts into concrete expression, simply because they are an internal state. As far as the world can tell, this person may not have greatly altered, except that inwardly there is a new insight, there is a new depth of consciousness which has not been apparent before. This new depth of consciousness is the thing that reveals the Muslim saint. Is the mystic and all that he stands for. Now, in the same concept of the Rubaiyat, therefore, the assembly of the mystics is a tavern. We find that the Last Supper of Jesus was in an inn, and in the East, the inn and the tavern are the same. And in the early lines of the Rubaiyat, we find the use of the term temple and tavern interchanged in a single quatrain. We are assured, for example, that there is no reason why the drowsy worshippers should wait outside the tavern when the temple is set within. This is a rather interesting point, for the tavern actually signifies only the place where these brethren gather for the mystery of the spiritual Eucharist. The tavern is in larger terms, the world. For the world is the great temple. The world is the great place of experience. The world is where souls gather for a day. It is a rest house along the road of the infinite. It is part of this chain of caravanserai which link the deserts together. So to the Sufi, instead of referring to the temple, which would of course immediately expose their religious purpose, they could easily refer to their gathering place as the town tavern. But when you got to this tavern, it would be most likely a little mosque on the outside of this town, or perhaps only a prayer rug on the sand. The tavern was simply the gathering place of the mystics. It was like the strange arbor or rose garden of the Illuminists. The tavern, therefore, naturally carries into various other phases of the mysticism itself. Of course, in all the Rubaiyat and in practically all Near Eastern poetry, we find the romance of the rose. The rose is a universal symbol of these people for the heart, which is the seat of the mystical power in man. It is the symbol of the universal love principle of God. It plays the part in Western symbolism that the lotus does in Eastern religious lore. It is the emblem of the unfoldment of consciousness. And there is no doubt at all, even from the manifestos, that it was the mysterious rose of Damascus that later brought to Europe the concept of the rose of the rosy cross. The rose goes back to biblical symbolism also in the two great mysteries of love and regeneration. as set forth in the story of the Rose of Sharon and the Lily of the Field. These were the two great symbols. The symbols of man's purification and unfoldment through love, and his resurrection through faith. Thus we still have the use of the Easter lily as the symbol of the fulfillment of the promise of resurrection. And resurrection to the Sufi was simply the release of the love of God in his own heart, by which God came into life again in him as an eternal power. In the Rubaiyat we also find the references to the rose. And by the symbolism, we know that the Muslims, in their Orthodox poetry and in their Orthodox symbolism, use the rose as a symbol of human love. Thus it would be especially appropriate that the mystics should use the same symbol, but should transform it from the mysterious rose of mortality that must die to the eternal immortal rose of Dante's Paradiso, upon the petals of which stood the great array of the hierarchs of heaven. So Dante's rose, the rose of the troubadour, the mysterious rose of Attis in the ancient Greek legend, the rose symbolized in the alchemical transformations, all these grow on a single stem. And the Sufi realized this and came to the simple conclusion that as the rose in alchemy signifies the great transforming agent, so the rose, as the experience of God, is the great Redeemer, the great transforming agent which changes the whole nature and life of every created thing. If we want to get a little closer to how interesting a way this symbolism was projected into various things, we can refer to one of the best-known quatrains of the Rubaiyat, where we hear the words, "A book of verse underneath the bough, a jug of wine, a loaf of bread, and thou beside me singing in the wilderness. Our wilderness is paradise enow." And I'll take the thought of this a little bit. Of course, the book of verse is the Masnavi, the great scriptural book of the mystics. It is the realization or belief that they had that poetry is the divine language. They did not have this as a unique attitude. Others have held the same. But to them, the book of verse symbolized much more than the Quran, although it could include it. It represented the mysterious love poems of the lovers of God. Now, when we have the book of verse underneath the bough, we come into a term which is well known in Europe, but we haven't thought about it. The term under the bough simply means secrecy. It has been used this way in countless literary works. It is the symbol of something not publicly or generally known. It has to do with a secret meeting, a clandestine meeting of some kind, or a thing hidden. We also use the term under the rose for the same usage. You'll find some very interesting studies of this if you go into early language books. So what we are really saying is the sacred book secretly studied or known and carried into the secret assembly of the wise. The jug of wine, of course, is the Eucharist. The loaf of bread is the rest of the Eucharistic ritual, the bread and the wine. Then we have the next thought. Thou. This has to be capitalized. The moment you do this, you understand its meaning. Thou, in this case, is again a play upon an old Gnostic concept in which the infinite presence of deity is embodied in the person of the Virgin Sophia, the beloved of the world, which in turn is taken from the Canticles of the song which is Solomon's. So we have here the secret scripture, or the mystical scripture, the hidden place of assembly, the ritual of the Eucharist, and the mysterious power of God singing in the wilderness. And truly, under such conditions, the wilderness is paradise now. The paradise is merely the paradisio, or the lifting up of consciousness into the internal life. The whole symbolism is derived from some very interesting double meanings. And when we begin to understand these double meanings, we are no longer so concerned over the pessimism, and materiality, and sensuousness of old Omar. We begin to find out something of what he really meant. Now, the dervishes also were a mystical sect of the time, but the dervishes, like most mystical organizations, were also sharply divided within themselves. The true dervish, the follower of Jalaluddin Rumi, was a saintly scholar. But there were other dervishes that went into the marketplaces and stood before the mosques, and some were called the howling dervish, because they just simply stood all day long and shrieked and howled and groaned their misfortunes to high heaven. Others were called the whirling dervishes, because they spent their time dancing a strange circular dance, which was supposed to symbolize the motion of the spheres. And if they could whirl their own bodies into perfect union with universal motion, they would become one with eternity. It was their concept of things. Now, Omar points out the fallacy of some of this type of thing. When he speaks of these dervishes and their external ceremonies, and he uses them to cover all ordinary formalistic religion. So he says, let the dervish flout, for from my base metal will be filed the key that shall unlock the door they howl without. Now, here is not pure pessimism. Here is the man who has been writing about nothing being of any importance but the vine, that the flower that once has blown forever dies, that there is no future for anything or anyone. And then he turns suddenly and says, from my base metal shall be filed the key that shall unlock the door of the divine house. Here it is obvious that he is not in a pessimistic mood, nor is he in any way differing from the most ancient tradition, namely that through the regeneration of his own nature must be found the key which unlocks the mystery of the infinite universe of truth. Here Omar becomes practically, idealistically optimistic. He points out one of the most fundamental principles of mysticism that he certainly would not mention if he did not wish to, as it was in conflict with the general tone of his poem. But he is reminding us that what he is doing is to divide the universe into two very distinct parts. That in one of these parts, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, not all your piety nor wit can lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all your tears wash out one word of it. Here is kismet. Here is the utter fatality of the great processes of law. Buddha pointed this out also. He pointed out that there was no escape from the great law of cause and effect except the Mahaparinirvana. There was no way in which the individual could escape from the infinite patterns of existence until he suspended existence within himself, until he was able to identify himself completely with the causeless and nameless reality at the root of existence. To Buddha, this nameless and causeless reality was an infinite extension of total existence, total being, beyond good and evil, beyond everything that we know, beyond condition. The Muslim, taking the same general attitude, saw in this beyondness a union with an infinitely benevolent existence. That this power that was beyond all condition was a power that man could experience by a supreme effort of his own consciousness. And that this experience carried him above and beyond the moving finger and the chessboard. But in some way he had to transcend all these things. For man without this enlightenment, there is no relief from this emergency except the false oblivion which he suggests by the wine. And by the false use of the wine, he suggests, as the Egyptians did, an old meaning of the vine. To the Egyptians, particularly the members of the Osirian cult of the early Ptolemaic period in Egypt, the vine had two meanings. First of all, its tendrils and its strange way of growth suggested infinite complication or complexity, the entwining and entwisting of things. And secondly, its strange intoxicating power, the Egyptians believed, was due to the fact that the grape, putting its roots down into the earth, was nourished by the blood of the dead. That all the strange decomposition of life that lay under the surface of the earth, the last dust of heroes, supplied the vine which lived off of the dust of greatness. That therefore all the conflicts of the ages, all the hates and fears of everything that had lived and died, was carried into the vine. And therefore, in ancient times, it was customary to plant the vines on old battlefields. And the grape that grew was changed into a wine in which the old wars were fought again, and the strange confusion and discord and fantasy of delirium. Omar is telling us a little about this in his poem. But what he wants us to particularly remember is that this mortal wine, the wine of the forgetfulness of sorrow, is nothing more or less than man's present way of life, the way of life in which we try to forget reality by becoming drunk with unreality. We take of the wine of success. We decide that wealth will provide us with the escape from the melancholy realization of our own infirmity. That through career, through ambition, through the attainment of high station, through the successful marriage, through the brilliant children, by gaining the envy of our neighbors, by excelling others in some extravagance, we have then, in a mysterious way, escaped from the smallness of ourselves. To Omar, this is nothing more or less than becoming drunk with worldliness. That we pass into inebriation and final unconsciousness by destroying within our inner consciousness the power to sense the infirmities of our own nature. We overlook what we do not want to see. And even in psychology, we realize that one of the most common failings of the neurotic is that he does become an alcoholic. And an alcoholic is always a person who is running away. He is running away from the sober acceptance of things in life which either hurt him or frighten him. He is running away from a smallness in himself which he does not wish to conquer, but which he wishes to forget. So the mortal wine, the wine of the earth, is a wine of forgetfulness. It is a wine which brought with it the bacchantic fury of the Greeks and the Dionysian orgies of the Romans. It was the complete concept of the individual attempting by the total gratification of his senses to forget that there is no actual gratification possible. But no matter how we avoid the implications, no matter how we struggle with the problems, the individual can never escape from the smallness of himself. He can never escape from the limitations imposed by nature upon his own existence unless he is able, by seeking within himself, to find the metal from which the key of his salvation shall be cut or made. So Omar divides this alcoholism, so to say, into two kinds. One which has to do with the wine of forgetfulness. Man's trying to forget that he is little. And the wine of remembrance, which is man's internal, sudden realization of the presence of God. And perhaps in the highest phase of the Sufi mystics, man suddenly overwhelmed by the realization that he is one with God, that he is united to God by an experience of consciousness. So one is the kind of exaltation which is accompanied by a terrible hangover the next day, and the other is this other kind of exaltation, which is accompanied by eternal union with truth. Omar uses the vine in both these senses, as is proper according to the philosophy of most Eastern peoples, that every outside negative, formal, physical thing is but the shadow of an eternal truth hidden within it. The whole universe, therefore, becomes the symbol of this transformation within man. The uncertainty, the strange longings, the endless motion of mortal life is also represented in the Rubaiyat by the ocean. The ancient seas in their sable raiments. And this ocean, therefore, which is forever singing its sad song, the great hollow roar of the sea. This is life itself, the strange pageantries of existence, with this great confusion singing its sad dirge to its master. Omar gets quite nostalgic over this type of thinking, but it all has to do with the strange forlornness of the soul that is divided from God. It is the strange sadness of that which goes to sleep in the earth and is not born again, simply because it believes this, that it has not found the secret of its own everlastingness. And here, I believe, Islam borrowed a great deal from the later Egyptian religion, which was one of the first to indicate the importance of the individual achieving a consciousness during life in order that he might carry a different level of psychic integration into the after-death state. So for Omar, this world in which we live is like the Arabian desert or the great city or the small rural countryside that we know. It is the home, the mansion, the apartment, the single room. Whatever we want to call it, this world is divided only by a mysterious focus of consciousness from a vast experience which man can always reach if he wants to. The Persian mystics describe how in the presence of the saints, the walls of the little houses seem to fade away. All of a sudden, little rooms become as large as eternity, and things greatly distant seem immediately at hand. All the limitations imposed by the mind and the body vanish as consciousness unfolds. And consciousness takes all walls and changes them into doors and windows. The individual is never very far from this mystical experience if his own consciousness permits it. Then Omar takes for us, as he has with the vine, the secret of love itself. He considers, much as Plotinus did, the various kinds of affection of which man is capable. He tells something of the affection of man for his country, of man for the principles which he regards as true, the friendship of man for man in the struggle of existence, the love of child and parent, the recognition of the love of brother and sister, the love of husband and wife. All these different forms of affection have something to do with the compound mystery of love itself. Nearly everyone in the course of life at some time experiences an affection of one degree or another. The more completely this affection dominates the individual, the more completely love is perfected in human life, the more nearly love approaches the mystical. There is something that is the symbol, the outerness of the inner mystery of divine love in human affection. Thus, through the symbolism of human affection, the Sufi seeks to define divine affection. He points out the moods and circumstances in which human beings not only have their loves but their hates. He points out the willingness that we have to sacrifice under the spur of a great affection, perhaps even life itself, without hesitation for someone for whom we deeply care. This unselfish surrendering of self also finds itself again in the song which is Solomon's, where in the end Solomon, after passing through the three stages of his song, finally comes to the ultimate conclusion: I am my beloved's. The personal self has gradually been sublimated. The purpose of great affection, therefore, in the symbolism of the Sufi is that it is the shadow of divine love. It is man's ability to sense something of the infinite, just as the rising of the sun in the east at dawn makes it possible for man to sense something of universal light. Not very much, but something. He can feel that light, as it rises in the world, must rise also in the spirit. He also knows that love, which can make weak, frightened people strangely strong and above fear, that this in some way is a reflection of a greater power. For some way, in the simple act of loving, man outgrows himself. He raises himself above himself. And the Sufi, thinking about this, realized that here perhaps was the strange language of lovers as represented in the mystical poetry of the Near East. Here everything is transformed, and out of the ordinary human attitudes are born those which have to do with the greaterness of universal realities. The idea, therefore, that it is possible for man to experience the perfect love of God and perfect love for God becomes the very essence of illumination. I think this also leads indirectly, perhaps, to the same end that you have in the Mahayana Buddhist teaching. Mahayana inserted between the mortal state of mind and the infinite of the Mahaparinirvana, the mysterious Western paradise of Amitabha. The Muslim mystic, and in Muslimism in general, has this paradisial. It has Muhammad's paradise. It has the region to which those go who have kept the covenant and obeyed the law. Yet it must seem to these mystics, as it has seemed to some Western Christian mystics, that this idea that somewhere beyond the grave is a celestial city, foursquare, on a foundation of jewels, some way must have some other meaning than that which is literally suggested. It is very hard to assume today that the mysterious city of the book of Revelation should be regarded as a factual place somewhere in space. The Buddhist did not believe that his Western paradise was a place. He recognized it as a condition of consciousness. The Christian mystic did the same thing with his ideas, and so did the Muslim mystic. So in the Muslim poetry and in the Muslim art, for that matter, and in literature and in fable and legend and in the 1001 Nights, the Muslim has the idea of a mysterious world, a world of infinite delights, a world of endless gardens, a world of music and song, a world of pleasure and freedom from all pain that we know here. This world is across a mysterious river that divides this region from that region which is beyond, of the same river across which the Amidist is brought in safety by the mysterious ship of the doctrine. In the Muslim concept, therefore, the individual seeking within himself comes first to the radiant inner life, which might be called the region of the beloved. This, as we said last week, was the mysterious invisible garden of the inner self. There are three steps in the psychological unfoldment of man in these things. The first step is the mortal world as it is, a world ruled over by the inflexible rules of cause and effect. Man, by keeping these rules, by obeying, by following the Beatitudes and the Ten Commandments, finally comes in relation to a life of virtue. He feels that he has lived well, that he has lived beautifully, that he has lived nobly. He has earned certain rewards. And according to the old mystical tradition, this means that his own inner consciousness, what we would term his subconscious nature, his inner nature, where today all the demons and ghosts of the subconscious are said to reside, that in this inner life of himself, his inner temple, the sanctuary of his soul, his own good deeds build a beautiful region in which he can dwell. The invisible paradisio is therefore an inner life free from stress. It is a subconscious in which there is no pain, in which there is no doubt, there are no intensities causing us to be unhappy or unpleasant. That the individual sitting down quietly and moving into his own internal finds there peace and beauty, and finds constructive interests and high dedications and noble sentiments. For this person in this state, the ordinary emanations with which we find persons endowed are no longer active, because there is no inharmony within. There will be no harshness of speech. There will be no negative thoughts, no criticism, no condemnation of others. The individual, because his own inner life is right, will be like the mysterious Sir Galahad of the Grail cycle. He had the strength of many because his heart was pure. And this pureness of heart is the pure land. And the person who lives in it is also not only enjoying the achievements of inward integrity, but because he has these, he is living outwardly in harmony with the laws. The person who has found the beauty of Sukravati's golden shore is no longer setting up bad karma here by his action. He is not doing the things that will bring pain to others, and therefore must ultimately bring pain to himself. Living harmlessly in the light of truth, in the great radiance of Amitabha's blessed presence, the individual, having achieved the integration of his inner life, lives at peace with his God and at peace with all men. This is the middle ground. This is the paradiso. Here the individual goes into his inner garden, and instead of finding there fears and doubts and prejudices, he finds truly that he is in a garden filled with magnificent, if phantom, flowers. He finds here the little fenced enclosure where the unicorn lives. He finds also here the secrets of the tamings of all beasts. He finds ever music in the air. Nothing seems to grow old and nothing seems to die. Everything is beautiful in this mirage world of peace. If he is a very pious person and has great dedication to devotional things, he may observe within this inner garden a little mosque or shrine, and here he will worship in the peace of his own inner life, for he has created this mosque or this shrine with his own insight. And because he has built it according to the law, the ancient holy ones in their green robes and their turbans coiled for the pilgrimage to Mecca will meet him there, and they will converse in the quietness of the garden. This garden is almost another form of the Adinic idea. The garden that was man's before he fell into intellect, before he began the conspiring for worldliness which has dominated his efforts for ages. And to the mystic, in this garden he also comes to meet his beloved, whom he finds walking in the garden as a marvelous, radiant, symbolic figure. And like the troubadour, he composes songs to the beauty of his beloved. And to his beloved he offers his life and his worldly goods, anything that he has. He desires nothing but the presence of this object of his eternal desire. And so he lives loving God, finding in the action of selfless adoration perhaps the highest of all religious worship. But this is not the end. The time must come when the individual must go on to the full mystery of the universe. Not only must he realize that he is in this spiritual state of grace, but he must go on like the yogi of India to the final, complete loss of his own existence in the object of his desire, which is God. So finally he outgrows the garden also. He outgrows the desire to love as we know it, or to even venerate. He moves closer and closer to complete identification, which is the Buddhistic idea of the nirvana or the Hindu samadhi. It is the complete suspension of existence in the experience of identity with God. Bohm apparently finds easy words for this experience. It can be intellectualized, it can be dramatized, it can be diagrammed. But the great mystics who have dared to make some expression of this final sense of yogic identity have all more or less come to the same general thinking. It is still the great love. It is still this strange, wonderful affection, but it is suddenly transformed back again to the beginning of life. It is the love of the small child. The mystic experiences again the strange, perhaps unreasonable love of the child for parent, a strange trust, a love that is not built upon experience which has already been strangely left behind, a love which is more that of a very small child going to sleep in its mother's arms. It is all absolute simplicity again. All the rationale of it, all the great mysteries of rounds and races, all these things have faded away. The individual senses the mysterious experience of this utter and complete security that comes from complete identification with the object of the world's desire, which is truth, love, reality, God. So in the great samadhi, emotion again passes through another sublimation. We see something of this sublimation even in the common affairs of people. Great emotions are apt to be intensely expressed, but in moments of great grief we are silent. In moments of great joy we may weep. In moments in which the very depths of ourselves is touched by some tremendous experience, in these moments we can only be as the Sufi is, completely silent. There is something that is simply beyond expression, that transcends any instrument by which we can interpret it. And this is what the Sufi is reaching out to try to define, try to understand. This absolute silence, which is the fullness of all feeling. This transcendence of the ability to express, but to instead be completely enfolded in the experience, absorbed in it, one with it. This, I think, corresponds to the Vedantic samadhi. In this, the beloved is no longer adored and worshipped. The individual no longer offers as the knight-errant did to defend the blessed damosel in distress. There is no longer the chivalry, the giving up of life for another. There is more than this. There is the giving up of existence in God. The return of the individual to some kind of mysterious sleep in space, going to sleep forever in the arms of the beloved. And out of this sleep, the mystic may also perhaps have a gentle wonder in his soul. If he does, he never really puts it into words. It is only intimated between lines and in symbols. What happens at the end of sleep? Does the child awake again? Does it stir once more into some kind of an existence? Just as surely as sleep relieves man from the care of existence, sleep in turn has another shore, a man comes forth again into some kind of an experience. Buddha does not deny this. The Muslim does not deny it. But he knows that, like Omar, he has ascended through the seven worlds and on the throne of Saturn sate. And many are not unraveled by the way, but not the master lot of human fate. What is beyond? What is that which transcends? What is it that the infinite love of God has determined for the creation which it loves? Does this creation return to sleep forever in the great rose of the divine heart? Does it wake again? Does it wake as part of God? Is it then actually God? Does it go to sleep as man and awake as divinity? Even the mystic, the Sufi, is not sure. He is not strong enough to answer this question. But I think in the mysterious teaching of it all, the Sufi assumes the possibility that there is a kind of consciousness which we might term God consciousness, which as mortals we know nothing about. To us, a consciousness must be a self-awareness of ourselves. And through this self-awareness, the awareness of other things. But supposing there is an entirely different way of being conscious. Suppose in returning to the source of all consciousness, which is the divine, that we suddenly discover that there are other dimensions of existence, that there may be something beyond consciousness that we know. Perhaps there is something that permeates everything. Perhaps this divine love that enfolds all the world is really some kind of a region, some kind of a level of existence which we can reach, and then our own love will mingle with that of the infinite. Perhaps there is a way or a time or a condition in space where man himself can actually experience infinite love and find in this experience infinite life turning back to him. Perhaps somewhere other things will seek man as man has sought God. It is very abstract and very difficult. We do not know. But somewhere in the entire Sufi mystery of things, the whole universe is transmuted or transformed into levels of love and insight. In order to start this mysterious journey, we must some way begin to substitute the simple fact of honest love for practically every other emotion that we use. For all emotions, finally, are either forms of love, or they are opposites or destroyers of love. So in the Sufi mysteries and in these systems of thought, we ascend continuously by a series of experiences. And perhaps the same thought is found in the Gospels, where it is asked, if you cannot love your brother whom you have seen, how can you love your Father in heaven whom you have not seen? Love, therefore, begins by the loving of that which is in need, immediately. And in the very process of serving another, of forgetting self in the love of another being, in the forgetting of self-interest in the service of another being, the end of criticism and the defense of that other being, instead of seeking forever what is wrong in people, beginning to experience what is right in them because God is in them, and that has to be right. Little by little, we can experience the beginning of a universal emotion. For it is love itself which must civilize mankind and bind up all the wounds of human antagonisms. It is love itself that seems to sing in the forests. It is love whose voice is heard in the flowing of the brook. Somewhere, some way, when man first unselfishly loves, he has his first true experience of God. The Sufi knew this, knew it with all his heart and soul. He knew that the loveless life is the strange, forlorn existence which man seeks to drown out with the mind. The first experience of the willingness of the person to sacrifice his own opinions to preserve the faith of his fellow man, to put the good of another truly and honestly above his own, the happiness of another above his own. To do this because in his heart he has awakened the sense that it is far better, far more wonderful in the soul itself to be dedicated to the happiness of another. In this way, we experience a strange growth, a growth of sacrifice, which makes us strong, a growth of giving, which makes us like God. But Diogenes pointed out that the reason that men are men is because they must receive, and gods are gods because they always give. Out of this, we begin to see a universe in which the unfoldment of our own honorable affection becomes the great path of evolution. I think this is really the inner meaning, the great psychic significance of the Persian poets, and this is what, in substance, I have gained from the examination of Omar. That this is his double story, a story which, if you are wise, you can sense, but most of all, you will know what he means and understand what he is trying to tell you if in your heart you have loved. If you have loved, his words sing. If you have not loved, his words sigh with a strange, deep melancholy. Well, our time is up, so I guess that's all this evening.